I mean, we have really a humanitarian disaster about to occur in Europe. Do you think that leads to the end of this war? I mean, I'm talking just months away.
Yes, I think that the war will end, especially when Berlin decides that this can't go on any longer. Berlin is the major power in Europe. There are two major powers in Europe, and this is what Americans need to understand, Tom. One is Berlin, the other is Moscow. Now, what does that mean in Paris? What does it mean in London? I think eventually those governments will also throw in the towel on us. And I think we're going to throw in the towel. And I say that because there are already discussions in the White House, in the State Department, behind the scenes saying, look, this is not working out as planned. We are not damaging Russia. You know, everything that you're hearing about the failures in Russia, you apply those to Ukraine. Russia is not running out of troops. Russia has enormous resources. Russia has a population that's, 3-4 times the size of Ukraine. Russia is not losing the war. It's not going to lose the war. And people are saying, how do we get out of this? And I think ultimately what will happen is that the Europeans will take the initiative and there will be discussions and it will end. And the Ukrainians are going to be told to shut up and color. And the Ukrainians aren't going to like it, but I imagine that that'll be the end of Mr. Zelensky and he can retire to his estates somewhere in Italy and out on the outskirts of Miami with his friends and his funding from various oligarchs, including Soros. But I don't think it will go on indefinitely. And here in the United States, you know what we do when things fall apart? What do we do, Tom? What do Americans do? We stop talking about it.
Yeah. How do we declare victory once we lose?
Yeah. Well, you don't even have to declare victory because if we go back and look just over the last 6 months, we went for months with very little discussion of anything happening in Ukraine. It virtually disappeared from the front page, so to say. Then all of a sudden, we had this drive-by shooting to Izium, where there were no Russians. And the Russians took almost no casualties, just walked out and said, fine, knock yourselves out. We have other fish to fry down in the Donbass, especially in Bakhmut, which is a town in southern Ukraine that is the hub, the last hub of logistical support and resistance there. That's about to be taken over and destroyed. And then that's the next step to Odessa. But we've heard nothing. And then all of a sudden, this drive-by shooting has become evidence for the sort of Ukraine rising from the ashes like the phoenix. Now, it's all nonsense. And this too will pass. And what we do is what we did after Vietnam. We leave. We say nothing. And the damage is done. What have we done in Afghanistan and Iraq? We've largely left. How often do we talk about it? We maintain a very small force in Iraq. 1,000 people, 1,500 people or something connected with the embassy. And then we have 400 or 500 people up in Syria. And we're reluctant to completely pull out for fear that, we'll be castigated here at home in the media as having surrendered, as having failed. Well, we've already failed. It's already over. The initiative is passed. We don't control anything. But Americans then are given something else to focus on. And I think the thing that Americans are going to focus on, correct me if you think I'm wrong, is what's happening here.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. We're going to feel economic effects from this. And I guess until it gets as bad as in Europe, nobody will question this foreign policy because it largely doesn't affect us. We don't, no bombs drop on our cities. And that's really the saddest thing. Let's hope that before things get really dire in Europe, that what you described happens sooner than later. I think that's the best we can hope for, right?
No, I think so. And I think this will be a catharsis that the Europeans, especially the Germans, have to go through, because the Germans moved into the sort of comfortable position as permanently apologizing for everything bad in the world for the last 75 years. And now they realize, well, listen, that's over. And if we continue to insist on making ourselves dependent on the United States, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So we've got to forge a new policy. We've got to build our own future. We've got to chart a new course into that future. That's very important. I frankly think that the Europeans need to think in those terms. and it's way overdue. And this, of course, was President Trump's view, that they had to be their quote unquote own first responders. But I think he was absolutely right. And in today's world, given the nature of modern technology, you cannot reenact World War II anymore. It won't work.
Listen, I know your time is valuable. I have one more question for you on the political landscape. If Trump were to get back in your experience with Trump's first administration, how different was the foreign policy? Obviously, there was a foot off the gas pedal approach as far as all these regime changes and not just active wars, but coups and what was going on in Libya and so many other countries in the Middle East. Would we expect more than just foot off the gas and a substantive change if there were a second Trump administration?
Well, that depends heavily on two things. First of all, the people with whom he's going to surround himself. And unfortunately, I still see many of the same people surrounding the president today who were there at the end of his administration. In most cases, those were bad choices, providing bad advice and bad information. I think he needs a new slate, frankly. People who are really committed to the America First agenda and its supporting pillars. The second thing is we don't know what's going to happen in this midterm election. Everyone is assuming that the Republicans are going to sweep the House and the Senate. My question is, well, let's assume that happens. Who are all these Republicans that are going to support the president? Show me their names. Well, we know some of them. But based on my own experience, the majority of the Republicans were deeply rooted in the swamp along with their Democratic colleagues. In other words, if you look at the stupidity that's happening in Eastern Europe, because from the very beginning, it never occurred to me that we would ever drag out this war in Eastern Ukraine. I thought for sure that the president would immediately call Putin and say, look, let's call a ceasefire. Let's sit down. We've got to come to some sort of arrangement here. We respect your legitimate security interests. And we also want peace for Ukraine. We'll accept neutrality. Let's negotiate the rest of it. It never happened. The opposite happened. We threatened regime change in Moscow, which of course is crazy. So where are these Republicans who are actually going to support the American First agenda? I'm not sure there are enough of them there that would enable the president to come in another 2 years and run the country. In other words, we've got to go through some more problems of our own here in the United States. I mean, how much criminality are Americans willing to put up with? I mean, if I look at Philadelphia, where I grew up, North Philadelphia has been bad for decades, but it's a war zone. We have many war zones in many large urban centers. How long are we going to put up with this? There are too many Americans who say, well, it doesn't affect me. You know, what's the problem? Same thing with open borders and millions of illegals pouring into the country. Oh, well, people, they want to come here. Well, I don't give a damn. We don't want them here. We can't afford them. We can't assimilate them. The economy doesn't need them. That's all nonsense. We have to secure the borders. Are we going to do that? And then you turn to the armed forces. Are the armed forces going to secure the borders? Will the armed forces defend the state here at home? I'm not talking about overseas. We've got problems with the armed forces now, staggering problems that Americans have no idea what's happening inside the armed forces. So the bottom line is, I don't know.
And a guy with an opinion like me about this whole Ukraine debacle under the Joe Biden regime, our friend retired Colonel Doug McGregor. Colonel, I don't think in my 48 years on this rock, I have ever seen a more grotesque display of political theater in our house. And I've been watching politics since I was a kid. My grandmother that raised me was a Reaganite. She loved Reagan. And I have never seen something like that. That was disgusting last night.
Well, it certainly was theater, Dan. You've got that right. Americans need to understand that they're watching a couple of things happen. The first is a massive wealth transfer. It's not necessarily going to Ukraine. Some of that money will end up in Ukraine. At this point, we're already paying for the army, for the bureaucracy, for the state. But that's actually minor in terms of expense. The largest portion of the money just goes to DOD to replace equipment that is being sent and then subsequently moves to the defense industries, who profit enormously. The donors who keep the politicians in office are then rewarded because of their investments with the defense industries, and they then take some of that money and recycle it back into the politicians on the Hill as an expression of gratitude. Thank you for transferring all this wealth to us. Here is your cut. So that's why you had so many Republicans desert, go ahead and support the left, because they're really part of the uniparty. They're all enriching themselves. So that's the first piece of theater. The second piece of theater, which Americans don't really understand either, is that the Ukrainian army in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. They've taken hundreds of thousands of casualties. They're way north of 100,000 dead, closing in on 150,000 dead. The 93rd Ukrainian Army Brigade was just withdrawn from Bakhmut, which has been turned into a Ukrainian bloodbath by the Russians, and they left after suffering 70% casualties. For them, that means that out of 4,000 men, only 2,800 were left behind. In other words, 70% were left behind. They pulled out with about 1,200 men. That's a catastrophe. Wow. That's what's really happening. And when the Russians finally launch their offensive, Americans are going to watch this entire house of cards collapse. And then the real question is, will someone stand up and finally put an end to this utterly false narrative, which has enriched lots of people here, but hasn't done much good for the United States, as you point out?
And how about we point this out? Has it done any good for the Ukrainian people, the innocent people caught in the middle? No. That's what they keep trying to pull at our heartstrings so you can open up our purse strings, is help the people. Hey, I'm all for helping innocent people. How about the innocent American people who are getting screwed right now on how many different things I listed? But you're not helping them by dragging this war out for another year, because we're almost at a year now, where nothing's happened. And by the way, Colonel, you just threw out numbers and battles I've never heard or seen anywhere in mainstream.
No, good news is the only thing that's reported, and it's supposedly Ukrainian good news.
Right.
In reality, we haven't had much good news from Ukraine for a long time. This whole thing is going to come to a halt. There's no question about it. The question is, will anybody notice? Because other than you and a few other people, the mainstream media really doesn't cover this.
No.
And they could simply change the subject. Yeah, something else President Biden said at the end. He said, not only will we support Ukraine as long as it takes, he said, we will support Ukraine as long as it's there.
Yeah, I heard that.
That was his last comment.
Yeah, what do you make of that? As long as
Ukraine
it's
is not going to Ukraine is not going to be there much longer the way things are headed. That's the sad truth.
Wow.
And we don't want to rescue them. See, this is the problem. The real danger is that once it becomes clear the whole fraud is collapsing, there'll be voices in Washington saying, well, let's send in our troops with the Poles. The Poles can provide what we need in addition to the troops we don't have. We can bring in Romanians, and we can somehow or another recover from this disaster. No, we can't. We're not prepared to fight a war in that region against Russia. Russia is prepared to fight a war, however, against us. You don't go into an area when you're not prepared. We don't have the ammunition. We don't have the replacements. We don't have the equipment. This is not the time and the place to do that. So the right thing to do is the thing that we have refused to do, and that is to urge Zelensky, and frankly, since we control the purse strings, simply tell him, stop and negotiate.
Yeah. Well, and you saw President Trump put out, I think yesterday on Truth, that this war would be over. Actually, he was speaking with our Chanel Rion here at OAN, and he said it'd be over in a day if I were Commander-in-Chief tomorrow, because I'd make a call to both of them. And I'd demand it, and we would start talking about sanctions that would crush Russia, and we'd tell Zelensky, like you just said, you're going to negotiate, and he'd get them both to the table and end this damn war. But you don't hear about it from Biden whatsoever because of what you just laid out in your first soundbite about how everybody's making money off this, and how fitting is it, I'm going to circle back to the omnibus bill as we wrap things up, Colonel, because that bill getting approved by the Senate and 18 defectors, Blunt, Boozman, Capito, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Graham, Inhofe, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Portman, Romney, Rounds, Shelby, Thuney, Wicker, and Young. Screw all 18 of you. Those are the 18 Republicans who sided with Dems to push this $1.7 trillion omnibus through that's going to put $45 billion more towards the war. And as the Colonel just told you, it's not going to end up in Ukraine in the way of ammunition and guns and tanks. It's going to go right back to the military-industrial complex and politicians on both sides of the aisle. So why not ram it through while you're still in charge of the House before the end of the year? It's all a game, it's all theater, and it's all to enrich them. And Colonel, I'm amazed you're one of the only ones speaking up. So I hope you're watching your six, because I don't hear many other folks telling the truth out there.
Well, Dan, you and I are not on the payroll.
That's right.
Everybody else who's
You're damn
supporting
right.
this is benefiting.